So now we are online. And hello and welcome, comrades from the YouTube channel Midwestern Marx. The link to this channel you can find in the description. And we will speak today about complicated question with the Marxist theory. So firstly, could you present your channel, your activity, who you are, and all this stuff?
We're editors at the Midwestern Marx Institute. It's a institute for Marxist theory and political analysis out of the U.S., although we have correspondents from around the world. Our main goal in this moment in the U.S. is political education, the development of a genuine and unique American Marxism that helps us understand our current situation and move forward in a revolutionary manner. And we do that in as broad a form as possible, whether it's through social media activity and TikTok, which we've been censored through, but we've been able to gain quite a bit of traction on there, or through website articles, or through our publishing press with books, or through our scholarly journals, or our YouTube segments, which include anything from more laid back podcast discussions to interviews with leading Marxist scholars from around the world and communist militants. So a little bit of everything, but the central thrust of it is that it's a educational institute out of the U.S. hoping to provide some ideological clarity in these troubling times.
Okay, so maybe first question, do you know something about the history of socialism in Poland? Do you know some Marxists from Poland? Do you know the history of the communist movement which existed in 19th century, and also the history of the Polish People's Republic?
Do you want to take that one, Carlos? I don't know a lot about Polish history. I do know we know a bit about Soviet history in general. Poland is sort of a hole in my personal knowledge. So that's why if you have something on that, Carlos, I'd love to hear it.
Actually, one of the first Marxists that I read that were somewhat influential for me was Adam Schaff, who was the professor of philosophy at the University of Warsaw, Poland, and a member of the Polish Academy of Sciences. And his book on Marxism and the human individual was very interesting. It dealt with questions that are conceived to be more related to the earlier Marx, the question of alienation, of the question of the role of the individual in Marxist theory. And I think it did a really good job in attaining, I think, the correct position, because it's a book that's embedded in a debate between the Althusserians, and now they try to lump in some of the other Marxist Leninists and Marxist theorists out of the socialist camp with the Althusserians, and the Western Marxist humanists on the other side, where the humanists were saying that the early Marx of the one that's focused more so on alienation and embedded in a Hegelian Feuerbachian jargon, that's the real Marx, which conveniently enough, the real Marx is the one that comes in the manner of manuscripts that are less than 200 pages, not the one that writes 3 volumes of Capital, Theories of Surplus Value, but the other side was saying just the alienation discussion, more specifically the Althusserians. They try to lump in the Soviet theorists, and that's not correct. The Soviet theorists appreciated the role of alienation and how it developed in Marx, but the other side of the debate with the Althusserians was that the question of alienation was just a youthful musing for Marx, that it doesn't really hold any weight, and that there's this epistemic break that takes place right around the time that he's writing what we know now as the German Ideology, a book, but it was actually a series of articles that him, Engels, and a few other of the German young Hegelians were embarking on to try to create a journal out of. There's this idea that there's this epistemic break, and so the youthful writings don't really matter. It's a Marx before Marxism. And what Adam Schaff does is a position that I hold, and that some leading Marxist scholars today, like Marcello Musto. He just recently published an anthology on Marx's writings on alienation. What he proves in his anthology is that the theme of alienation and the theme of, human emancipation in that form of discussion, it doesn't leave Marx in 1846. It sticks around and concretizes and refines itself throughout the whole of Marx's life. And you can see similar humanistic the tinges if you really read, Capital closely, if you read specifically the Grundrisse, where he's using similar terminology as he was when he was younger. So that's the connection that I have with Adam Schaff, and I've read some of his other works as well. But yeah, that's as close as I've gotten to the Polish left.
Can I add a little bit in there, please?
Of course.
Great. So speaking of the Grundrisse, I think it is, and it wasn't really out when Althusser himself was working, but it does give us a lot of tips into how Marx thought, because it's his own shorthands. It's his own sort of way of taking notes as he's setting up things to write. But on the sort of young Marx and old Marx subject, what they seem to be doing is separating Marx into two completely separate things. And the dialectical materialist method that Marx creates prevents us from doing this, right? It instructs us in how to read Marx himself and apply it to him and anyone else, that you need that foundation, you need that young Marx to change over time as he grows, etc., and learns, and become the older Marx, which still has the kernel of the young Marx within it, and couldn't be any other way.
Yes, I would like to say that I am in the very big impression that Adam Schaff. It's a very big surprise. I think that if I ask most of the Polish people, do they know who is Adam Schaff? Of course, they will don't know. So bravo that you know him. I would like to add about him that in the time of the building socialism in Poland, he had a very good position, but unfortunately him and many other Polish Marxists in the after, when there was a problem in the socialist Poland, he became revisionist or even social democrat. So we need to remember that when we talk about the most of the Marxists from the socialist bloc, that they very often change their position, and if somebody lived long, that normally when in the 1990s or the beginning 21st century, they are social democrats or even liberal and anti-communists. So also I would like to add that for the people who know nothing about the history of the communist movement in Poland, I would like to say that in the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, communist movement in Poland was very, very strong. The better example is the participation of the Polish workers in the revolution 1905, and in this time every socialist movement in the world looked what's happened in Poland, what's happened in Russia, and they were impressed the power of the movement, the creation of the Soviets, and all these stuff. Unfortunately, now the communist movement in Poland is totally destroyed, and the Pole in the 19th century was a synonym of the revolutionary, because most of the Polish people who participated in the insurrection, after they were active in the revolutionary movement. For example, there were many Polish who participated in the Commune de Paris. in 1871. But there are a lot of examples. The Polish, it's a little similar for the activity of the Kurdish people now in the leftist movement in Western Europe. That in every country, France, Germany, England, and you can find the activity of the Kurds, and there are a lot of leftist organizations. They are strong, they are disciplined. So but it was before. Now it's changed. Now the Poland is one of the Polish population is one of the most anti-communist. Is more than 30 years of the anti-communist propaganda, anti-communist brainwashing. So I made this channel and I made this conversation to change it, and I hope that you will help me. So so I prepared some question for you. It's a question easy, I think, for you, and so I will read. I would like to know what do you what is your answer. So first question: in Marx's time, there was a continuous numerical growth of the industrial working class. In 1988, 89, as a result of the capitalist counter-revolution, there was a desindustrialization of Poland and a rapid decline of the working class. Similar phenomena later followed in other Western countries. From this perspective, how do you assess the chances of victory of the proletarian revolution in the countries of the West?
That's a great question. You know, there is a really large parallel here to our country, the United States, in deindustrialization and what this does to the proletariat. Here, you know, we've had anti-communist propaganda since the beginning, really. And that's affected things. What really affected things was the rise of our middle class. And this laid the groundwork for deindustrialization here. And what we seem to be seeing now is what we call a higher stage of imperialism. There's a lot of theorists in China, like Cheng and Fu, right now, that discuss imperialism as being in a higher stage. But basically, the way imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, this neoliberal order that the entire West has gone into, and former Soviet countries, countries like Poland, must get subsumed by, right? That causes a shift, and that middle class to be reproletarianized. Now, I'm not sure what things in Poland look like, but here, what that means is all of the children of our middle class are falling down to a level very similar to the proletariat, in a sort of way that there's no ability to accumulate any stability. Debt is forced on them. They're stuck in menial service jobs, and there is no way out. And this is sort of the defining essence that creates the proletariat in the first place, so that, and then the rest is sort of characteristics that are built by the history around it, right? So what we seem to have here is the proletariat having shrunk, still in a revolutionary position, but in need of an ally, which is, in the US at least, the reproletariat. And I see it as very similar to the original Worker-Peasant Alliance, in the ability of the proletariat to rally the material interests of all the working people together.
Yeah, I think that there's this important distinction that's made in Marxism, and more specifically in Marxism-Leninism, between the proletariat, which exists at the point of production, and whose work functions as productive labor, which doesn't necessarily mean that it produces a tangible object. There's productive labor that doesn't produce tangible objects, and it also doesn't mean that productive is good labor, unproductive is bad labor. There's no normative tinge. It's just a more technical way that Marx describes some of the differences within the working mass as a whole. And in Capital itself, he's still considering the distinctions between productive and unproductive labor to be distinctions within the proletariat as a whole. One of the things that I think that we must emphasize is a statement that Engels makes. I believe it's in Anti-Düring, which is that definitions are the death of science, because definitions by their very nature, they take phenomena that exist in movement and interconnection and freeze them and reify them from that context and take them away from the atmosphere in which they live. And so the way that Marx looks at the question of the proletariat is itself dynamic. The most basic abstract level is a class of people that without having means for subsistence are forced to sell their labor power in order to survive. But then that definition itself concretizes in various forms, and you see in Capital and agricultural proletariat, you see the industrial proletariat, which is itself the heart of industrial capitalism. And the stages that come after that, it's the proletariat that's most directly exploited and out of whose surplus value and exploitation really the condition for the possibility of the wages and the salaries of other parts of the working mass arise. But you also see Marx describe, again, these unproductive segments of the proletariat as proletariat. And he's constantly using metaphors in Capital to, servants in ancient slave societies that are basically existing as what today we would call service workers. And although they're unproductive, Marx wants to continue holding to the idea that they are exploited and they're part of this revolutionary proletariat class. So I think that although the industrial working class has shrank, I still believe in the idea that we developed here out of the Communist Party from figures like Henry Winston, which is the idea that industrial working class are the front rankers in the struggle of the proletariat. They're at the front because they're the ones out of whose surplus value, again, everything is created and everything is premised on the surplus value extracted at that point of production. But nonetheless, the proletariat as a whole continues to be a revolutionary class. And with this phenomenon that Noah describes as reproletarianization, the effects that we had in the post-World War II era, where we had the growth of a middle class in the U.S., the growth of petty bourgeois consciousness in a big faction of the population that otherwise previously would have been part of the proletariat and could have developed, proletarian class consciousness. With the development of neoliberal capitalism, that's being destroyed. And we have to remember, the conditions that lead to this. You have a very serious crisis in the 70s in the Western capitalist world. You have had for the last 2-3 centuries before that a continuous fall in the rate of profit, and capital's faced with an option: either I invest in developing industry, which is not as profitable as it was, it's barely profitable, or I take the speculative route of financialization. And capital here in the West, in the US, in Britain, and certain other parts of Europe to a more limited extent, it went down the route of financialization. And those effects reflect themselves in the determinate form the proletariat in the US has taken. And primarily, if you pick out of a pool of 100, 90% of the time you're going to pick a working class person within the service sector in the US, as opposed to one within some of the more productive industries, which would have been the case, maybe 70 years ago.
So I would like to say two things. First, this question about desindustrialization in Poland, it was a political decision without any economic sense. That when the Solidarity take power in 1989, they were scared that the big factories, the mines, the places, the shipyard in the Gdańsk and Szczecin, which they showed how they are powerful in the time of the strikes against the socialist Poland. The first things what they do? They destroy these factories to destroy the big concentration of the well-organized working class. And it was very stupid because 15 years later, when Poland became a member of the European Union, the Polish workers are the cheapest one, maybe not the cheapest because they are Romanian and Bulgars who are we make a competition with other Eastern European workers, but the wages in Poland were 7 times smaller than in Western Europe. Now is maybe 3 or 4 times smaller, but Poland profited that in the last 15 years when the Poland is now member of European Union. We have some reindustrialization, but this working class which was created now is different working class which existed in socialist Poland. In socialist Poland, there were very big factories, and all this industry which was in Poland was produced from A to Z in Poland. That the resources was extracted in Poland, and now we have situation that we have some things which are important, for example, from China. But in Poland, they are taking together, and this is produced in European Union. So we have the factories which we can close in one day, and they can move these factories to another country. But this example that the capital always search the place where is the cheap labor, shown that in 1990s the Polish workers were cheap, but they destroyed the proletariat in Poland in 1990s because it was very well organized force, and so this is the first wings. And second, now I don't know if you are, I told you or not, I am not living in Poland. Since 9 years I am living in France. Also because when I was active politically in Poland, I have some problems. So now I don't have problems, and I am living in France. I participated in Yellow Vest movement 4 years ago, and now I am. I tried to write a book about Yellow Vest movement, and one thing which is very important to me that I have examined the history of the class struggle in France, and the Yellow Vest movement, in my opinion, it was not proletarian movement, but either the petit bourgeois movement. There were some proletarian, there were unemployment people, but there were also some small entrepreneur, stuff like this. And when we look at the history of the revolutionary movement in France, we see some very interesting thing, that all the time when we have big revolution, the bourgeois revolution in 1789, after 1830, after 1848, or even Commune de Paris, all this time was this revolution made not by the proletarian, but by the artisans. I don't know how it is translation in English, but this guy, the petit bourgeois, who are they own place to workshop, to which they are in the same time the property of the you understand what I'm saying, and when they started to make industrialization of France, and the proletariat became the most important force in France, the revolution in France stopped. We don't have any revolutionary success which we can compare to this revolution which existed before. When we have this revolutionary, when we have this proletarian movement, big proletarian industrial class in France, the revolution in France stopped. And one thing which I try to understand, but nobody can explain me, that in the time of the Yellow Vest movement, we have division of the working people in France. I am emigrant and I work in the place with another emigrant. Most of them, they came from Africa, and they didn't participate in this movement. So the proletariat didn't participate in revolutionary movement, and in the same time petty bourgeois make activity which I consider that it was revolutionary activity. After we can ask question if this was fighting for the socialism, it was anti-capitalist movement or not, but it was revolutionary movement. They have force, courage to fight, and I am interested. What do you think about this?
Just broad strokes generally, if we look at history, a lot of what creates revolutionary motion isn't so much the proletariat having fully formed and becoming itself, but the process, the beginning of the process of proletarianization. And this is one of the reasons we put so much emphasis on what we called reproletarianization earlier. If you look at in Russia, for example, it was as capitalism was beginning and as the old way the peasants were living was no longer possible. And I think we see a lot of this happening right now in de-industrialized countries, right? As imperialism sort of goes into more and more acute crises, the middle classes are disappearing. And it's this that is pushing people into motion.
I think you also present a question from a more historical angle. You mentioned that when something along the lines of when the working class, when the industrial working class was at its largest and most organized, was when less revolutionary activity took place. Or did I misunderstand what you were saying?
Maybe we don't have any historic any revolution which we can compare with the revolutionary activity in the, before Commune de Paris. We have some activity that we have communist movement which existed in the time of the Second World War, and the welfare state in France were introduced in the first government created in 1944, and it was the coalition government with also 4 ministers from the Communist Party of France, and the leader of this party, Maurice Thorez, he was responsible to creating something which is called in France sécurité sociale. A sécurité sociale, it's pensions, it's
social security.
Yes. It's very, very good system, and bourgeoisie tried to destroy this even 40 years, and they destroy, but there's still a lot of things to destroy. This pension reform, which now Macron introduced 1 month ago, and yesterday in France we have very, very big mobilization. In Paris there was 500,000 people who demonstrated. In all the France, more than 2 million people. And the pensions, it is also sécurité sociale, and it was introduced by the communists. So I don't want to say that the French proletariat did nothing, because it's not true. But he don't take political power.
Right. I think that this has been like one of the most important questions in Marxist scholarship ever since the failure of the revolutions in Europe following the Bolshevik Revolution. Everyone expected up until like 1922 to 24 that Europe would erupt, specifically starting in Germany and then rolling across Europe, and it didn't. It didn't really happen. And a variety of ways of thinking about this issue emerged. Um, Most famously, perhaps Gramsci's, which developed the idea that as opposed to Russia, which did not have the chance to develop what he called the integrated state, a state that takes within itself civil society and that is able to, at a whole nother level, solidify the hegemony of the ruling forces. Russia wasn't able to do that, so it was easier for the Bolsheviks to break through. And it was more directly a war of maneuvers and less of a war of position. So less of an ideological war and more so of a direct frontal attack against the existing forces of Tsarism and capitalism. And the idea was that in Europe had been able to, thanks to the 1848 revolutions, consolidate a state that was much more complex and that was much more involved in the ideological construction of society, such that peoples whose fundamental interests were opposed to the existing order were identifying with it at a whole nother level, at not just the level of ideas, but at the emotional level, at the level of passions. So the work that Gramsci says that in light of that, the main battle in Europe ends up being a war of positions, a war of ideas, and ideological warfare against this ruling hegemony. And he doesn't use the term counter hegemony. This is a term that comes after with Gramscian scholars, but he pushed the idea that what needed to be promoted was proletarian hegemony. So we needed to have our own institutions that shared our own ideas, that developed our own art and our own ethic and ethical political transformations at the at the comprehensive level of changing the human being, and that was necessary for Europe. There's a similar there's an interpretation that, while not rejecting that, says something different about why the proletariat didn't act in a more revolutionary manner, and it comes from this scholar within the tradition of analytic Marxism, which Noah and myself and the folks at the Institute are not in that tradition. We adhere to the traditional dialectical materialist worldview as the philosophy of Marxism. But I think this fella, he's a professor at NYU and one of the ideological leaders of the he's the editor of this journal in the U.S., Catalyst, which is one of the main theoretical journals of the democratic socialist movement. His name is Vivek Shibber, and we've interviewed him before, and he's got this theory of the this materialist theory for explaining why the proletariat doesn't act in the ways that it would seem almost intuitive for it to act, which is in a revolutionary manner. And his idea is that, as opposed to the idea that it's fully ideology which keeps the proletariat contained in their positions, he says it's material factors that condition the proletariat to resign themselves to the existing order for the sake of just like not starving, right? So the level of precarity that working people are subject to if they decide to be more militant is something very, very harsh, right? We have in the U.S. an example of right now Starbucks is one of the places that's unionizing the most. And one of the frequent tactics that the owners are using is, whenever a vote for unionizing is positive, they just shut the whole store down. And what happens at the level of working people's everyday life when that is the case? Well, they lose their job, they lose their ability to pay rent. If they're students, they lose their ability to pay for their semester fees in their school. If they're in debt, like the vast majority of Americans are, they can't pay debt. So it's a very difficult condition that working people are put in if they decide to organize in a revolutionary manner. And so what this theorist, Vivek Shibber, what he says is that, it's not necessarily ideology that keeps them contained, it's the material conditions. And where ideology comes to play is as the force which says, even though these difficulties can be experienced by you if you do X, Y, or Z, if you act in a revolutionary manner, it is still worth it. So ideology has a more positive role than the role that Gramsci saw, which is one of containment, and then a positive role. So it's not that ideological warfare doesn't play an important role. It does, but we have to realize that as working people, the future that we face if we organize in a revolutionary manner is very dull, because the capitalist has the ability to just throw us off work. And what do? We just joined the 600,000 homeless people wandering around in the U.S. with 33 times as many empty homes. So that's a factor that I know, at least in the U.S., plays a very important role, and it's played an unexamined role. Now, the role of the Communist Party should be to take the most militant elements of that working class movement and secure a living for them. This is the idea that Lenin had of professional revolutionaries, right? The people who have the skill and who are charismatic and who are the sort of people that their fellow workers can look up to, and who are developed theoretically and who have the ability to spread class consciousness across the proletariat. These people are obviously going to be targeted by the bosses, but they have the ability to take that risk because the party would back them up. And because we don't have a strong communist party, because of decades of attacks, the crumbling of the Soviet Union, a variety of factors. But because we don't have a strong communist party, we don't have those material conditions in place that would secure, at the most basic everyday level, the existence of working people who decide to take leading roles in revolutionary militancy.
That ties real quick into the one thing I would add to that is that you need both subjective and objective factors to accomplish revolution, right? This is something, I mean, the dialectic teaches us, but Lenin explicitly goes into it, what objective factors we are necessary, and then how we can intervene in that subjectively. And the fact is that we've been behind in the West for decades now, since really even before the fall of the Soviets. We've just been behind. We had Euro-communism. In the U.S., we were just kind of following the Soviets around by the tail. Excuse me. But in order to genuinely advance, we not only need the most advanced revolutionary theory, we also need to take into account what the sort of current social consciousness is and best way to present that to people. These professional revolutionaries, Carlos mentioned them being charismatic. That's a necessity in the 2000s. It just is, where people make snap judgments on everything. And I think that's something communists often forget because we get so blown away by this sort of objective truth we're uncovering as we learn Marxism. We tend to forget that just being correct isn't enough. You need to be correct and also be able to show people that, be able to show that you have the way forward, the way out of the crisis, because an impossible crisis is coming. We know this through the general laws of development. And if we aren't there to follow through on that and play that subjective role, we end up with fascism. Carlos likes to quote Walter Benjamin, who is sort of the only redeemable figure from the Frankfurt School, right? Who says that every fascist rising is a failed socialist revolution.
I would like to say that I didn't wanted to present this discussion in the way that it's very popular, especially in the student circles, talking now the working class, it is no longer revolutionary. It was not my goal. I only wanted to say that now I see some paradox that the working class are very, very passive, and in the same time, the other class, the small bourgeois class or small entrepreneur, or I don't know how to name it, they, in my point, in the last years, they are more active than working class. So it was the base of my question. And when I see the situation in Poland, in these two sides, ideological sides and the material sides, the working class are in very bad shape. In the ideological class, it is a shame to be a worker. Every day from morning to evening, they present the propaganda that if you are a worker, you are a loser, and you have to be entrepreneur to make your own business, because if you work for somebody, you are nothing, you are zero, and it's brainwashing. It's already 30 years, and the workers people are they they very often are not often, but sometimes they go in the street. For example, in October 2020, we have some movement, anti-government movement in Poland. It was provoked by the ban of the abortion, but it was bigger than ban of abortion. It was big movement, anti-government movement. It was very powerful, but it's only 2 or 3 weeks, and after it was totally destroyed. So the workers, the most people who participate in this movement were people who worked like workers, but they didn't want to present themselves like workers. They tried to find some other identity, because telling that you are a worker, it's a shame in Poland, and I think that in the old countries with the neoliberal counter-revolution, it is the same. And the other question is the material situation. This big difference between the workers from emigration in France, like me and the people with our work, and these guys who organize the Yellow Vest movement, is that these guys who organize Yellow Vest movement, in theory, they are rich because they own the house. Of course, this house that they need to pay to bank the credit, but they own house. They have car. They have some machine. They have something, and they are not the. And if you pay a lot of money to buy a house, and this you are not flexible to the capital, because when capital closed something in your small city, you are desperate, and worker are, if they close your factory, no problem. Next month, I will go to another city. I will find another job, and it is something that this small bourgeoisie with already in ideological perspective 20-30 years, they say that small bourgeoisie it's the better people in the society, and also they have some material resources, and it is why in the last years in Poland, if we have some political activity, it's very often people who I don't consider like a proletariat.
Just real quick, I think it's funny, in the US, we seem to have the exact opposite issue, where the remnants of our middle class want to act like they're working class, want to act like they're oppressed, and focus very, very much on identity issues that will let them play that role. It's interesting to hear the sort of reverse propaganda happening there. Regarding middle class radicalism, this is a fascinating topic for me that I've been diving very deeply into lately. One of our greatest proletarian leaders in the US, his name was Gus Hall. He wrote a piece in 1970 called The Crisis of Petty Bourgeois Radicalism. And it explains how the radicalism of the middle classes hits a wall of unreality because they're not really dealing with a mass politics based in class, and explains how it goes from there. I've been trying to update this theory and apply it to modern America. It's actually going to be a piece for an upcoming book we have, but I think you would get a lot out of that piece by Gus Hall. It's on the Marxist Internet Archive if you're ever interested in reading it, Mikhail.
Could you repeat the last sentence? You asked question?
Oh, yeah. I just said, if you're interested in reading that piece, I think you would really like it, especially the way you're describing the middle class radicalism.
Okay. Thank you. I watched the question which I prepared for you. I see that I prepared 10 questions, but it's not necessary. We have very important discussion, and even if we have only one question, but it's not problem. But do you have something to add, or I ask second question? Comrade Carlos.
No, yeah, we can roll into the second question if you want.
Okay, so my second question was it's how is the witchering of the state presented in Marx's writings? What exactly is it supposed to look like? What will the transition from capitalism to communism look like? And did the USSR follow Marx's path?
Yeah, this is a very important question. The first thing I'd like to say is that although it might seem like it, there's no like real like blueprint in Marxism. He's never like saying, okay, this is going to happen in this detailed way, and it's going to lead to that and to this and that. And he gives you tendencies that you can, if you follow the dialectical development of society and history, you can say, well, this is likely going to happen, and it's going to happen like this, and the forces that exist now allow us to see that this is most likely going to develop into this. But he's not giving a blueprint. That's the first thing that I wanted to lay down. Now, how communism is discussed. Well, there's a variety of ways that communism is discussed in relationship to the abolition of the state. The most traditional way that it's presented is that the bourgeois state is abolished. It's replaced with a proletarian state, which we call the dictatorship of the proletariat. It is an intermediary state to get us to the ultimate goal, which is communism, which is a stateless society. And the proletarian state is not abolished, but it just withers away. It grows superfluous with time. So the formula has usually been abolish and wither, right? Now, I think that the question, the historical period that we're still in the period of abolish, and thinking about, constituting proletarian states. And one of the things that happens after the success of the Bolshevik Revolution is that Lenin begins to attempt to concretize some of the things that he had been writing about in texts like State and Revolution, which are some of the traditional ideas of Marx and Engels about what a new socialist proletarian state required. And what he quickly found, first is, of course, a civil war that's supported by the invasion of 14 countries, which makes very difficult conditions to try to develop a socialist state in. But one of the things that the most important thing that he realizes around 1921, 1922, which is something that the Chinese realize or realize again in the post-cultural revolution era, before reform and opening up takes root, is that you need to develop an efficient state. You need that the first thing you need to do is develop a state that can protect the sovereignty of the people. Because as soon as your revolution succeeds, imperialism is knocking at the door. They're probably already there, especially after the Bolshevik Revolution. They've been already there while revolutions have succeeded. So the first thing you need to concentrate on is how to protect the revolution, how to protect the national sovereignty of your people. So you need to develop the state as much as possible and as efficiently as possible to do that. So instead of like thinking about, okay, how do we, remove the state? The main concern for revolutionaries has been, how do we develop it? How do we make the state even stronger so that we can protect ourselves from imperialism? And connected to that is, how do we run the economy in a more efficient way, right? How do we develop the forces of production more, right? The capitalism present an arm to the forces of production. Capitalism stops and prevents the development both at the level of the economic base of society, but also at the superstructural level. And the idea is that socialist relations of production are supposed to unleash the potential of the human community to be able to produce more, to do it more efficiently, to do it in line with, in creating, as China calls it, a harmony or a rational metabolism between nature and society. So it's supposed to be a better society. That's, one of the first things. And the condition of war communism and the conditions that led in the people led Lenin to realize that maybe something like NEP has to be tried, the new economic policy. A similar position is reached by the Chinese after the Cultural Revolution, where, yes, China in that period of the Cultural Revolution developed, in ways that were never seen before. For instance, life expectancy went from like 33 to 67. That had never been seen. Such a rise had never been seen in the history of humanity. So it's not that it was a failure or anything. There was large successes, but there was areas where there were failures that needed to be addressed, and they were addressed through reform and opening up in similar ways as Lenin addressed the problems of war communism with the NEP. So trying to roll back here into the question of the state, the main focus ends up becoming, how do we develop an efficient state to protect from imperialism, to protect the sovereignty of our people? How do we develop the economic forces of society, the cultural forces, so that we can genuinely build a better society, that when people engage with it, it's obvious to people that socialism is superior to capitalism. And there's an important distinction that's laid by Lenin, but then really developed nicely by Mao, between political and economic capital. Mao says we need to strip the political capital fully from the bourgeoisie, a full expropriation of political capital. Economic capital, we should treat it accordingly to context. Insofar as the bourgeoisie continues to be a progressive force, in the sense of it continues to play a role in helping us develop the forces of production, we can leave them there, but keep them away. It's like making a house child-proof. Keep the bourgeoisie away from political power, right? So this distinction is very much important, and it's grounded in Marx, because Marx is very clear already in the Communist Manifesto that the proletarian class grabs political power and rests. This is almost a direct quote: "Rest by degree the economic capital of the bourgeoisie." So, especially in the context of the revolutions which have taken place, which primarily have been in what's called backward areas that have been kept underdeveloped by imperialism, this is a very important point to make. One of the other things that I would say is that we need to start getting in the habit of thinking of communism not just as the classless, stateless, moneyless society that we're all aiming towards, a de-alienated society where oppression is abolished, exploitation is abolished, and the kingdom of freedom. We need to also start getting in the habit of thinking about communism in the way that Marx thinks about it in the German ideology, and Marx and Engels think about it in the German ideology, and in ways in which it is thought also in the Communist Manifesto, which is that communism is the real movement of history that abolishes the present state of things, right? And so what that makes communism is something that's much more emphasizing process and the revolutionary development of everyday life, rather than this idea that we're going to measure reality up against. And in my work and in the work of the Institute, we have been developing the concept of the purity fetish as a way to critique the parts of the left that look at the Soviet Union, that look at China, that look at Cuba, that look at socialist projects, amongst other things. But to stick to our topic, that look at socialism and say, this doesn't fit my ideal. My ideal is here. This is my pure ideal. And because it doesn't measure up to purity, I'm going to reject reality in favor of the ideal. And I think that is committing a very strong fallacy of dialectical thought. It's completely negating dialectical thought, thinking in lines of how bourgeois metaphysical thought has been thinking for the last 2,500 years, back to the Eleatics in Greece and their obsession with purity and the connection of purity and homogeneous oneness to truth. So the importance that we have to lay is, especially when you look at the development of socialism in Latin America, in places like Venezuela, in places like Nicaragua, in Bolivia, where they're not taking that traditional route that Marxists envision. We have to look at, is it abolishing the present state of things? How is it positioning itself with relationship to the most reactionary and conservative forces of the day, which are the imperialist forces, which might be socially conservative or socially liberal? They come in different varieties, especially in the US. So is it abolishing the present state of things? Is it developing the forces of production? Is it protecting its revolution through the development of a strong state? And I think that's how we have to start thinking about communism. At first develop the state, and then only after, maybe 100 years from now, can we start thinking about, has the proletarian state, has the dictatorship of the proletariat gotten to a point where the state is superfluous and it can wither away?
That's Carlos covered almost everything there. I would like to add, though, the real essence of Marxism is the study of motion, right? The motion of history, the world outlook that sees everything in interconnected motion. And stateless society is a conclusion, right? That the state arose because it was at a particular point in development and therefore must undevelop as well, like everything else in the universe. But there's a difference between the general laws. Marxism discovers the general laws of development and all of the particular ways that those general laws arise within the concrete world, within society. So what I like to say, it's something my dad used to say, is there ain't no recipe to bake a socialism pie, right? Just because the Soviets did X, Y, and Z, they planned like this, does not mean the Chinese will. In fact, it's very likely the Chinese will do it differently. It's also very likely we in the US will do it differently. And you guys in Poland, when you bring socialism back, will do it differently, or in France. And we understand this in what we call the universal and particular, right? That there is a universal sort of form, right? But that it takes shape in particular situations. So the proletariat always arises with the development of capitalism, but it's different in different places, in different societies, right? The proletariat of the USA does not develop in the way it did in Poland or in France. We had chattel slavery here, right? And this is just the conditions inform that. And what they also do is they create realistic avenues of possibility and action. And this is part of maintaining concreteness that, and just materialism, that a lot of people sort of believe that we have that recipe to make a socialism pie. And so they look at the USSR and they say, oh, they didn't do what Marx said. But the point is that Marx didn't say what they were going to do. They're just misunderstanding it. And I'm sure we'll get to this later, but what they do is read Marx as if he was a utopian, as if he did write a recipe book. I like to, with newer people, explain it as people want Marx and Engels and Lenin and everybody else to have written us a playbook to follow. Like if you like football or anything, you have a playbook where all the players run specific plays, they run a route at a specific time, etc. They didn't do that. What they did was they developed the language that playbooks are written in, and each team has its own playbook for each season.
I also wanted to add just real quick, because I think that both of us forgot it. It's a very elementary point, and it usually happens where we love getting into the weeds of things, and I think we forget the basics, which is that the state arises at a moment when society cannot contain itself because of the contradictions that exist between classes. And so the state is, by its very nature, an instrument of class rule, of the class domination of one class by another. What that means is that under the capitalist context, it is the capitalist state. It's a dictatorship of capital, which oppresses working people. Under a socialist context, a socialist state, it's going to function in the same way, but reversed on its head. It is a state which represses the exploiters and oppressors, which might still exist within a country, but which more specifically, the experience of the 20th century tells us, is that the role of the dictatorship or the proletariat, the repressive role, it's specifically going to be related to fighting off imperialism. So insofar as classes continue to exist in an antagonistic fashion at the global level, insofar as imperialism continues to be a force at the global level, the dictatorship or the proletariat it's going to be the most advanced form that a socialist society can take, which means repressing basically the enemies of the people and using the state to do that. And that's, of course, the experience for the vast majority of working people as democracy. There's always a dialectic of democracy and dictatorship. In capitalism, democracy is democracy for the rich, and that's experienced as genuine democracy for them. Under socialism, it's democracy for the many, democracy for working people, but dictatorship and repression for the bourgeoisie and for the imperialist forces.
You know, Lenin has a great quote about that. He says that a liberal can talk about democracy in general. A Marxist never forgets to ask, for which class?
Yes, I would like to say two things. First, it is practical consequences of this theory of the dying of the state, that in 1990s, the most important class struggles which were in Poland, and these class struggles were very, very important, it was the fight against privatization. So what is privatization? In the socialist Poland, the economy was controlled by the state. And when the liberals came to power, they said that now we need to make all what we can, that state will no longer rule the economy. So it was the theory of the Margaret Thatcher that the best politic of the state in the economy is the politic which don't exist. That state will not intervene in the economy. So we have some paradox that I, Marxist, support the class struggle, support the workers who fight. And in the same time, I say I am Marxist, and Marx is for making the state die or weak. Less state is better. And in this example is something contrary, that in our society it's a left force who are defending the state schools, state hospitals, state factories, and other things which state make good. And it's liberals which are saying we need to destroy all the taxes and privatize all the things, and then there will be only the army, and that's all. And so it is the one of the practical reason that repeating these things about the dying of the state is not practical in the from the worker struggle today. And second thing which I would like to say is the lesson of the Commune de Paris. For me, the most important lesson which we can take is that we have war, very, very aggressive war between France and Germany. And in the time when we have revolution in Paris, and the bourgeoisie in France is scared that this revolution will win in France, and the bourgeoisie in Germany is scared also that when it will be win in France, it will came to Germany and to other European states. So they decided that we stopped our war and we released all the prisoners which were in the German camps. They released the French officers, and these officers released by the Germans a few weeks later destroyed Commune de Paris. The same situation we look in the October Revolution. That the context of the October Revolution is the First World War. But when the revolution is victorious, the bourgeoisie in Europe make peace against the revolution. And I think that Marx, when he examined the Commune de Paris, he didn't understand how important is possibility that bourgeoisie from different countries, which have normally they have other interest. Now the most important interest of the bourgeoisie from many countries is destroy all the revolutionary movement, and for this we need very powerful revolutionary state. And all this talking about dying of the state is contre-revolutionary, is the anarchist bullshit, and it make easier for the bourgeoisie to destroy revolutions.
That's really, really well said, Mikhail. I think anarchists often act like we're anarchists, but with extra steps, right? Like, oh, don't worry, we all want no state. You guys just have a different way of going about getting to no state and being anarchist. But that isn't it at all. We view the entire world differently. And the idea that we can just demand there to be a state or demand there to be no state seems childish to me. Or like you said, anarchist bullshit, right? The state must be recognized as a phenomenon created by a certain period in history, right? By the irreconcilability of class antagonism. And until that's gone, there can be no talk of not having a state. It must be respected for what it is and studied in the ways it changes and how we can affect it.
Also remember that Marx dies in 83. So like the phenomenon of modern imperialism really doesn't kick off the ideas that, with the Berlin Conference and around the 1890s is when modern imperialism, according to Marxist-Leninist theory, develops. So there's certain phenomenon concerning how capitalism acts when it goes abroad that Marx just couldn't have predicted because they weren't taking place in the way they are now at his time. And a very clear instance, besides the role of imperialism in fighting against revolutionary movements in specific countries, which is something that Lenin also did not necessarily expect. You have, as soon as the 14 countries invade, you have certain articles where he's like, where did this come from? We have blockades. They came at us with everything. They tried to strangle the revolutionary baby in its crib. But now we know that that's been the case, and it will continue to be the case insofar as imperialism continues to exist. But another good example is Marx felt that when capitalism went abroad, it brought development. And so it was able to genuinely function as a progressive force in backward areas, bring capital and develop and destroy, certain forms of relationship that were holding the progression of history back in those areas. What we have found with imperialism is that it's the opposite. It's a force that underdevelops. It's a force that sustains poverty in the colonized world and prevents development in the colonized world. So it's been the complete opposite. For instance, Marx felt that the Russian Obshchina, the commune in Russia, could be revolutionary. And this is some of the things that he changes his mind on in the 60s and 70s and 80s. Right before he dies, he's reading a lot of anthropology, Maxim Kovalevsky. He's reading Henry Louis Morgan with Engels, and he's reading these anthropologists, and he's like, these traditional communities, they have communistic relations, and the idea is that if they can get a hold of the advanced forces of production in the West, they can build communism, or they can build socialism straight. They don't need to go through a capitalist stage. And the assumption there was that when capitalism goes abroad, it is able to develop those areas that it goes into. And imperialism has shown that it's the opposite. On the contrary, the force that presents the biggest fetter for the development of the third world is imperialism. That's another assumption that, you can't blame him. He didn't see it. You can't blame him for not seeing it. But that's something that, that's why we need Marxism-Leninism. It's not just Marxism. It's Marxism-Leninism that we adhere to and that we think is correct for our age.
Yeah, he actually was calling the Mexico incredibly reactionary for not embracing, the American takeover, and it talked about how progressive that would have been. I mean, the progressive nature of the early U.S. aside, I think that's a real focal point in the beginning of him seeing where he was wrong. And he's also writing with, towards the end of his life, like where Carlos was just talking about, and I forget their names, but there were a few Russian revolutionaries writing Marx to ask him about their peasantry and their rural economy and what they could do.
Vera Zasulich.
I'm sorry?
Vera Zasulich.
Vera Zasulich.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, and this is really where that solidifies, is those letters.
But he had before Vera Zasulich sends him the letter, and I think it's in 1881. There was this guy by the name of Mikhailovsky. He was a liberal in Russia, and he was criticizing the Marxists, and he was saying, if you really believe in Marxism, you should be all for capitalism coming to Russia and developing, because ultimately, if your ideas are true, it would then lead to socialism. And he wrote a draft response to that, criticizing the hell off of that position. And then the Vera Zasulich letter comes a couple years after, and he writes like 4 drafts, and then he shrinks from like a 30-something page response to like a 4-page response, where he's like, no, this historical unfolding that I have painted, he's referring to capital. Now we have much more material, but he's looking at capital, is something that's specific to Western European history. The development of history is not unilinear, right? It's a multilinear development where different parts of the world have had different stages. And, historical materialism, which is really the application of dialectical materialism to history, has to be applied in each of those contexts in order to understand the forces that play best, and to understand, which forces are really the most revolutionary in that context. If there's no proletariat, then, who do you go to? Well, you have this peasantry that is the productive class of that area, and that you can use. And, we saw that in China. We saw that to a certain extent in Cuba. Saw it in Vietnam. We saw it in Russia. So, Marxism is creative. We have this idea that We have no, the bourgeoisie loves giving out this idea, and some unfortunate souls within the Marxist movement accept it, that Marxism is a dogma, that, what Marx said, it's conclusive, and it's the conclusions that we align to. And that couldn't be any farther from the case. What Marxism gives us, as Noah very well said, is it's a worldview, a method that we continuously apply to the world, and sometimes our conclusions are going to be different from those that were said in 1880 and 1881. But when one calls themselves a Marxist, they're aligning their themselves to this tradition, to this worldview, to this method, not necessarily to specific conclusions that are dependent on time and place.
Lenin actually says that people who just memorize conclusions would be deplorable communists without a chance of ever being a real communist. But I want to stress that in order to understand Marxism itself, we have to have that analysis that everywhere is developing differently, right? That's within dialectical materialism. And so this notion that Marxism is Eurocentric, that's very hip in the bourgeois academy right now, is silly. It misunderstands Marxism altogether. There is no way to apply what happened in one society to another. You have to take the universal and its particular forms.
Okay, comrades, I have very big respect for your knowledge of the Marxist theory. So I prepared more questions, but I hope that there will be possibility to speak one more time or more time, because it's very, in my opinion, very good conversation. I would like to the last question which I would like to ask you is not which I wrote before, but temporary question. It's about the situation today in Ukraine, but it's connected to Marx. It's connected to Marx, and I will say you why. So a few weeks ago, in Poland, we celebrated, not me, but our government celebrated the 160th anniversary of the January insurrection. It was insurrection which started in 1863. It was the insurrections made by the nobles, by the aristocracy, against Russia, against Tsar. And it is important for the history of the communist movement, because in one of the meeting with the solidarity with this insurrection, they created First International. So it is some event very important for the history of the revolutionary communist movement. But I have some problems with this question, because this situation with this January insurrection is very similar now to the situation in Ukraine. Why? Because in this time, the governments, capitalist government of the Western Europe, they supported the Polish independent insurrections. They pushed them. For example, Napoleon the King Caesar of the France, he say, "I will help you. I'll help you. You need to fight. Sooner or later, there will be French army which help you." And very similar situation we have with the government of Great Britain, which also makes some promises to this. So you need to fight, but the most important, you need to kill maximum soldiers of the Tsar. And this situation is very similar to the situation at Western attitude towards Ukraine today. So you must fight against Russia. You must kill so many people, so many Russians as it is possible. We will give you some hope, but we will not help you. Maybe it's better. And the problem with situation which existed today is that some of the leftist forces, especially Trotskyists, they are together in one rank with the imperialist government against Russia. And Marx, he make the things very, very similar to these Trotskyist idiots today. That together with the Napoleon III and government of Britain, he supported Poles against Russia. And from the class perspective, it's very complicated because the peasants, they supported Tsar, because Tsar, he promised to make the reform of and he made it. He made it. It's very the two land reform which existed in Poland were made by the Russian forces. First, it was after January insurrection. Second was after Second World War, because never the Polish nobles gave anything to the Polish peasant. It's always Russian. First time Russian Tsar, second time Red Army. So, do you think that this position of Marx was Russophobic, and if can we support this position, especially in the context today? And also, can you say something? What is your position to the war in Ukraine?
I'll be really brief and let Carlos take this one mostly. So first, that was really incredibly insightful, Mikhail. I really enjoyed what you said. Marx relates Polish independence in this early area to Irish independence. And I think there's something to be said there for them not sharing a form because of colonialism. But at the same time, the parallel with the proxy that Ukraine is for the empire right now could not be more clear. I don't know if what I would do back then, but I know that as things have advanced and imperialism has taken the form it takes now, that one must be anti-imperialist in order to hold a position against capitalism within their country. We learn things from the Second International, social chauvinism, etc. And for all of the sort of fake Marxists running around talking about inter-imperialist rivalries and other nonsense, really what it is, and I'll go to a quote from Engels here, what these gentlemen lack is dialectics, right? When you're unable to see the world according to dialectical materialism, which is the best understanding of it, you're very, very easily manipulated. And these revolutionaries somehow keep finding themselves aligning with the ruling class that they say they're against. And my question is, at what point do they realize, wait a minute, I like everything the ruling class says. Am I a communist at all?
Right. Yeah, the way that Marx is seeing that issue in Poland is as a national bourgeois liberation struggle, akin, I would say more so to the 1848 revolutions, which were national bourgeois in character, but which included a proletarian element in it. And he's also looking at Tsarist Russia as a reactionary force, as a conservative force. And he's working under the idea that a bourgeois state, a bourgeois liberal democratic republic, is a more progressive moment in world history for all its flaws than a Tsarist feudal aristocratic Russia. And I think that there is a lot of similarities in the way that a people, whether it's Poland or Ukraine, are used in a proxy manner to fight against Russia, and ultimately are the ones being killed. But there's, the Russia that was in that context, in Poland and the Russia of today, I think have a central difference, which is that I think Russia today, although it's not communist, of course, it's not socialist, it is playing an objectively progressive role in world history because of its existence outside of the sphere of imperialism and because of its active role as one of the most important friends of both socialist projects and anti-imperialist projects in general. It's one of the most formidable, along with China, anti-imperialist forces existing outside of the sphere of influence of U.S. NATO empire. So I don't think that progressive character that Russia plays today is shared necessarily by Tsarist Russia at the time. So that would be, one of the differences that I would like to lay. As far as our view of the war, I think it's from what I can tell, I think it's pretty similar to yours, which is that Russia was basically forced into this situation. You've had a situation in the Ukraine since 2014 that there was a coup that was very much spearheaded by U.S. NATO-funded Nazi forces, which have been keeping the Russian ethnic population in Ukraine in a repressive state, banning the language, and just shelling the Donbass area, such that 14,000 people have been killed since 2014 before Russia even stepped foot in Ukraine. And I see the escalation that took place in February as defensive in character. The most progressive forces in the area, whether it's the Communist Party of Ukraine, which fascist Ukraine has banned, or whether it's the Communist Party of Donetsk or Lugansk, or the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, these forces have been asking Russia to step in to protect the ethnically Russian population in eastern Ukraine since 2014, because those populations have been asking Russia to step in. And Russia has hoped for peace, and it has sought out a Minsk agreements for peace. And now we know, thanks to the statements of Angela Merkel and others, that the Minsk agreements were just done in order to buy time, so that NATO and the U.S. can militarize Ukraine, so that it's not the case that Russia would have actually been fighting against Ukraine, and not a Ukraine that's been basically injected on NATO steroid in order to endure the way that it has endured and continues to endure. So I definitely see that Russia is playing a progressive role, and if we're really in favor of peace, if we're really in favor of stopping the bloodshed, we have to realize that the sole people that are to blame here are the U.S. and NATO and their puppets in Ukraine, which are the most disgusting Nazi and fascistic forces, and the biggest scum of the earth that you have at this moment in world history. You have a part of the left that loves screaming about how there's fascists in the U.S. because working class people voted for Trump and are carrying the slogan of "Make America Great Again." But then these same folks find it perfectly fine that the elected officials that they consider to be progressives and socialists are funding and giving the okay sign to sending more than $100 billion to fascists and Nazis in Ukraine to kill Russians. So it's just completely absurd, the position that the Western left has taken. And, it's rooted in the Second International and the inability to look at things in a global context, to look at the forces of imperialism and neocolonialism, because the parts of the third world and the global south that don't have puppet U.S. governments in place, those governments are on Russia's side, because they realize the historically progressive role that Russia is playing at this moment, even though it's not socialist, even though if we were in Russia, we wouldn't be with United Russia, we'd probably be with the CPRF. We still have to recognize that in terms of geopolitics, Russia is playing a tremendously progressive role in undermining U.S. imperialism, which is a decrepit force right now. So that's in essence our position. We want the bloodshed to stop, but the sole responsible party in its proliferation and its existence really has been the U.S. and NATO, which since the fall of the Soviet Union have been expanding eastward towards Russia and crossed a very clear set red line that even U.S. foreign policy officials have said, what the hell are we doing here? We're just escalating towards a nuclear Armageddon for no reason. So it's, there is a reason, of course. The U.S. is threatened by the, in a way, win-win relations, to use a concept that's used in China, the win-win relations that Russia has been able to engage in with Europe. And insofar as Europe can become independent from the U.S. and de-link its economies from the U.S., that presents an existential threat to U.S. imperialism. So, we see that with the attack of the Nord Stream pipeline, which was just revealed by Seymour Hersh to be done by the U.S. in collaboration with Norway. This is something that we have known since the attack took place. Any person who has been looking at the situation in any form of a critical, objective, concrete, dialectical form would have been able to tell you that. But now the mainstream media is ignoring it, of course. But the position that we have is that we want peace, and peace is obtained through rejecting the NATO narrative and through asking the people who have been fully responsible for the conflict to stop.
Yes, I would like to say something about this Nord Stream accident, that it was made in the day when they open a Baltic pipe. It is the stream, gas stream from Norway to Poland. And I said to my wife, it is not written and it is not public, but I said to my wife that who will profit and I said Norway and USA. I am very. It's not good that I didn't make a video about this to make a proof, but I was the first who knew that it's Norway and USA.
You would have probably been banned, because we made videos in our TikTok accounts with over 400,000 followers when we were getting videos on average getting 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 million views. When we said the truth, we got banned. And the people who lied and who continued to lie were propped up by the algorithms. They're still online even after they have waged a nonstop campaign against the people of our institute. We've had 2 of the institute members fired because of these Ukrainian neo-fascist, neo-Nazi mobs have emailed employers to get them fired. We've had like 6 accounts banned, and it's absurd because the falsity and lies are propped up, and then the truth is suppressed and banned. And the West wants to talk about dictatorship and freedom of speech. It's complete hypocrisy.
In last weeks in Poland, we have big wave of the repression to some people who collaborated with me. Collaborated, maybe it is not a good word, because I only was agree with their position towards the war, and I invite them to discuss with me in Polish. And in last. It started in the next week, the last week of the December, that some guys, one very old guy, he was the Secret Service came to his house and take his laptop and phone, because in the first day of the war he supported denazification, and he say something about Putin, and now he will be judged. And there are a lot of other examples like this. In the finish, I would like to ask you. I am very agreed that for the things which you said, that in USA also there are the people who thinks like me, but the question is. I know a little the situation in the left in the USA, and I think that your position is the minority. Could you say how many people, how many organization, things like you that in this and how many organization they support Zelensky and they promote this how to say primitive anti-Putinist propaganda.
Well, in the situation of being inside the imperialist country, I think it's important to understand that they don't have to necessarily be pro-Zelensky. They just have to be either pro-Zelensky or ambivalent. Therefore, it is then permission for the bourgeoisie to do what it's doing. A very strong stance against the neo-Nazi coup government in Ukraine is necessary to oppose our ruling class and oppose what's happening there and leading us into a possible nuclear war, which is terrifying. You're right that we're in the minority right now, but things, I'm not sure about how it is there, but things here are rapidly changing. Within the last 2 years alone, Marxism itself and real Marxism has resurged in the US like never before in history. Not even at the very beginning when Marxism was new did it grow this quickly. And I'm talking about real Marxism overcoming the distortions. Carlos mentioned there were almost 500,000 subscribers to the Midwestern Marx Institute's TikTok, and we keep getting more and more, and they keep banning them. So this, and there's a bunch of other symbols or signs that show us that we are on the sort of nascent aspect of this contradiction of a proletarian movement starting back up and Marxism coming back, and the old sort of decaying nature of what we call the fake left or the compatible left, as the CIA whistleblower. Oh God, I'm terrible with names.
I think it's Thomas something, but
I'm picturing his face on the interview, but it doesn't matter. But
right.
This is what he called it. This is what the CIA agents involved called what they created, the compatible left. And so that is what we had up until this period. And we're now beginning to overcome that. So I'm optimistic, even though we're still in the minority. Stalin, in his pamphlet or in the section of his book, Dialectical and Historical Materialism, said it is precisely because a thing is progressive and nascent that it is why Marxism focuses on it, because its development spells the undevelopment of the moribund force.
Yeah, and I think that the state of the left with relationship to this proxy war against Russia, it's very sad, but it's not unexpected. That's the thing. It's we could have expected it, because on the real difficult issues they always miss, because it's this purity fetish compatible left that always ends up functioning as left-wing legitimizers of empire. And that goes all the way back to Kautsky and the sellouts of the Second International. But I do think it's growing. And, one of the more surprising things that I've seen is that 35% of the American population in general is against, continual funding for this war against Russia. Now, if you look at, and this is very strange, if you look at the Trump voters, so the more conservative part of the U.S., which includes, a part of the big bourgeoisie, but parts of the petty bourgeoisie and a relatively decent part of the working class. If you look at those folks, it's in the mid 50s. So like 55% of them are against continuing to spend U.S. taxpayer money, more than 100 billion, on proliferating this proxy war against Russia. But the left has this purity fetish that because that part of the working class doesn't agree with all of their social values, because they have, it's true, certain bigoted views, they don't want to touch them. And they forget completely what the purpose of a revolutionary vanguard is, which is not to say, oh, that's the backward part of the working class, let me stay over here. No, it's to fucking go over there and remove their backwardness, to develop them and bring them out of backwardness, which you can only do it if you get them involved in the class struggle for socialism. If not, the fascists are going to be right there to take them, because that's where fascism is. In the same crisis that produces fertile conditions for socialism produces fertile conditions for fascism. So if we don't go there to these people that are right about the fact that this is a US NATO-led proxy war against Russia, and we don't show them something that's very easy to do, how this is connected to imperialism, and how imperialism is not a set of policies, it's not a specific government decision, imperialism is a stage of capitalism, there's nothing easier than showing the fact that war is connected to capitalism. And the leading anti-war, pro-peace people in the history of the U.S., people like Martin Luther King, W.E.B. Du Bois, all of these people have all been socialists for a reason. And they understood that capitalism and the militarism that it creates when it advances to the stage of imperialism cannot be separated the one from the other. But where is the left? Where is the left? Instead of participating in these massive mobilizations against war that are taking place right now in February 19th, they're saying that the mobilizations are too white, that there's too many white people, and that they didn't invite the black groups. That's what they're saying. And now they want to do mobilizations in March. And instead of calling, as important, it's the right that's doing it, but instead of, and parts of the left, there's people like the Green Party and stuff that are in there, instead of calling for the abolition of NATO, instead of blaming this whole thing on the people who are to blame, which is the US and NATO, they continue to try to play both sides by condemning the Russian invasion, but then also try to contextualize it in the situation. If you contextualize the situation, you can't condemn the Russian invasion because it stepped in to save people that had been 14,000 of them massacred over the last 7 to 8 years and had been begging them to step in. So it's a very complex situation, but I think that American communists and people with our position are more and more going to find more friends within the American people and the American working class than we are within the left.
Mao, I keep just adding a quote from a famous revolutionary to something much better that Carlos has said. But Mao said something really brilliant about this. He said, as to the backward workers, communists should befriend them and bring them forward. And if you're not doing that, you're not doing the job of a communist. You're not agitating. And so all of the people that Carlos referenced, just complaining that a movement is too white or whatever, which doesn't really make sense to me because 70% of our country is white. So of course, that's going to be the majority of any movement. That doesn't mean it excludes anyone, and it shouldn't exclude anyone. But rather than doing this, going into the backward strata, you find that these people are primed and ready to hear everything we have to say and are so surprised that you don't condemn them that they're the first to jump on board. I do it all the time.
Well, I will read a comment made by the comrade Yuri, which I spoke here a few weeks ago. Great conversation. Sorry, I have to go, but looking forward watching the entire conversation. My only question is, it is too long overdue for the Western left and certainly the Eastern European left to move beyond anti-communist leftism, the self-McCarthyism, self-red scare, red biting, and overcompensating that I am a good democratic socialist or Marxist-Leninist, unlike Stalin, Mao, the Kims, and whatnot. If you don't know Comrade Yuri, you can contact him and talk with, because also he have the similar position like us. And I would like to comment one thing which you said about the growing Marxism in USA. I don't know if in Poland Marxism is growing or not. My YouTube channel in Polish language growing very, very slowly. I have some viewers, but I would like to say that when the war in Ukraine was started, I have problems. I broke my ties with my party. I was a member. I was founder Polish Workers' Party. We have different problems, but we were not agreed towards our position to the war in Ukraine. They make position that to imperialism and Russia also is bad like NATO, and it was and now the in the last month most of the my collaboration, anti-war collaboration, which I made in my Polish channel and in the for the Polish audience, it's not with Marxists. It's very. There are some Marxists, my brother or a guy like this, or comrade Bruno and Monica from Paris. But most of the people which I collaborate now is the radical nationalists, the guys which were few years ago they were anti-Semite, but it is not very scary because we don't have Jews in Poland, so they are anti-Semite without Jews. All the Jews population were killed in the Second World War, and after some of them emigrated. Which so in the time of the epidemic they became the big anti-conspiracy movement, anti-COVID, anti-mask, anti-vaccine, all stuff like this. But they were active. They organized some demonstration against lockdown, and now they became the most important force against supporting Ukraine. So you see this dialectic, the guys which 5 years ago is the radical anti-communism and anti-Semite, after he became anti-Covidist, and now he became my comrade against NATO, because they are agree with me that Poles have to quit NATO. Poland, the U.S. soldiers which are now in Poland, I consider like the occupation force. They need to be kicked out now. And they are agree with me, and also we are for stopped sending weapons, sending Polish soldiers, and sending arms, money to Ukraine. That we are, and also we are agreed that all the Ukrainian refugees which are now in Poland with the Nazi tattoo or other Nazi symbolic have to be expelled from Poland today. That Poland is no country for the Banderist propaganda. If you are refugees from Ukraine and you are against Zelensky and against Banderites, no problem, you can stay, you can work with us. But if you if you want to be in Poland and promote Nazi propaganda, you need to be kicked out now. And it's only the only force, real force, which organized some demonstration in Poland. This is this nationalist and Marxist. Some of them support NATO, and these who are not support NATO, they are lazy and scary. Then they are cowards. They think that. The Polish secret forces 20 hours a day they watched what do they doing, and no, I can't say this because the atmosphere, and these nationalists they don't care. They organize one demonstration, second demonstration, they make posters, they make another things, and of course all the media hate them because now they repeat all this primitive propaganda that this is the agent of Russia, agent of Putin, and stuff like this. But I prefer collaborate with these guys which have a little courage, Then with the Marxists, which are, it's very, very complicated to explain
Mm.
Marxist as well.
You seem to give them more leeway than I do. I say if they are siding with imperialism, then they do not deserve the respect of calling them Marxists. They're no Marxists to me. And secondly, just real quick, I'm a Jew, and if someone wants to oppress me, that's their problem, right? I couldn't care less. If they have the power to oppress me, then it's my problem. Then I care. As long as it's some random thought in their heads that has no possibility of materializing in reality, I couldn't care less.
And yeah, it's I think that we talked earlier about the dialectic of the universal in particular, and this manifests itself not only in the forms that socialism takes, but also in the forms that class struggles take. So in the U.S., for instance, the struggle against racism has been a class struggle. It hasn't been just like anti-racist fighting. It's been a form of class struggle because when the working class is fragmented such that one part of it with a lighter pigmentation than the other wants to lynch the other and makes these lynching events into like collective picnics where people like buy the nails of the lynched black people. It's a disgusting spectacle. But when that's the case, fighting against racism is it's the same. It's class struggle, right? Because part of the essence of overcoming racism and these primitive ideas that are foisted on working people by the ruling class is showing them how the real enemy is in the case of the US, there was no black capitalists at the time, but the white capitalists, and that their friend is the black worker and the immigrant worker and all these other different workers. So I do think that in the case of like your friend who you mentioned is anti-Semitic, like in the process of struggling for an emancipatory movement, that's how these views change, right? They don't just change by people getting reprimanded. They change by coming into contact with the people that those people considered an other, uh, by coming into contact with those sorts of people and realizing the commonality of interest, realizing at their core we're all brothers and sisters fighting for socialism and fighting for the conquest of political power by our class. That's how things change. And we have an attitude in the US that's because of the anti-dialectical character of the thinking that most Marxists have, which is that things are the way they are and they will never change. And if there's something that we can count on happening, is change. If there's the only thing that's actually constant is the fact that there's nothing that's constant, that change is always taking place. And these people that have these backwards views, whether it's anti-Semitism in Poland or whether it's racism in the US, you know, you fight against racism simultaneously by showing them that the real enemy is not the other, but it's the capitalist. And in time, many of them are going to overcome their bigoted views. Some of them won't, and if they won't, then they continue to be, lost souls of a working class that they don't stand with. But the class struggle and the struggle against racism are conjoined, and you can't, by separating them from each other, you end up with these sort of liberal politics of representation as emancipation and the sort of thing that we get in the West. That we've been calling it wokeism, but yeah.
Yes, I would like to say that, of course, if we had Jew population in Poland and these guys were responsible for attacking them or killing them, the collaboration from my side, it will be no possible, but because it's a shame to collaborate with guy responsible for killing somebody because he is from other nation. But it's not a case. It's a long discussion, but it is some cultural background of the Polish villages that the anti-Semitism existed there always, or maybe not always, but 200 years that there was always that some Jew communities which are rich and some problems, and the question is why they change the now they are against NATO, because in the time of the epidemic they knew that the state is repressive, and they knew that the corporate media lie. And the first week of the war, when in Poland we have millions of Ukrainians who came to Poland, and before that, all the time they say you can't go to shop without mask, you can't go to shop without the showing your QR code, and all these things. And after there is war which started, media stopped to talk about the epidemic. Nobody care if these Ukrainians are vaccinated or not. Nobody cares if they have a QR code or not. This epidemic which in 1 week disappeared, and for everybody it was something that media are lying, and because media supported one side, automatically they are against media, so they supported other side, not because they love this other side, but because they are against this side, they are against this repressive state and this media. And also one very important thing, when we have division in Polish society, and I chosen to collaborate with these guys, which some of them are anti-Semitic, and it is anti-Semitic that in every phrase they try to say, okay, because in Polish government they are some Jewish people, or the bank they are some Jews, and no, and it is something you need to talk with psychiatry to understand what they have but it's not scary for me. And in the other side you have the progressive guys, all these anti-fascists, anti-racists, who supported the battalion Azov responsible for real killing Russian-speaking people in Donbass, and they don't care. I prefer, if I have choose between some racists and other races, I prefer to choose these races which are not responsible for killing anybody.
That's really well said. Really well said. Go ahead, Carlos. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, we see that here very clearly. All the progressive for, and what's funny is that the imagery that's used to describe Putin, they got like pictures of Putin with like the Hitler mustache. It's just absurd, the people fighting against the people with swastikas and tattoos of like Nazi insignia. Those are the Nazis, but then the people with the Nazi tattoos are like the anti-fascists. Like, what type of upside down world are these people, looking at? And what's funny is that, for a very long time, and it's still the case, it was hard to find the picture of like Ukrainian soldiers where a Nazi insignia wasn't visible, right? Like in Reuters pictures of a guy, a medic, and you see the swastika in his arm. It's like, what the hell, I mean, at least be good enough to find one guy that doesn't have a fucking Nazi tattoo. They all have it, and it's it's sickening that you have a situation like you have in the world right now where 52 countries voted against a resolution that wanted to combat the glorification of Nazism. And a country like the US, which has been consistently voting against that. So condemning, saying no to a resolution that wants to prevent people from glorifying Nazis. So they're perfectly fine with Nazi glorification. We just passed a bill, we just passed a resolution condemning the horrors of socialism. So we can condemn the horrors of socialism, but it's okay if we glorify Nazism. What does that tell you about the U.S. state?
And the worst part about that, Carlos and I actually read this in our social media live stream. The reasons they are condemning the horrors of socialism are the wildest lies you've ever heard. The whole, 100 million people killed by communism, and Stalin ate everyone's babies, and their babies' babies, and their babies' babies. It's absurd. And so these things are taken seriously by the ruling class, and at the same time, I just need to stress this again. At the same time, refusing to vote for a thing that would prevent glorification of Nazis over and over and over again. Where these so-called leftists that are okay with this come from, I have no idea.
Okay, guys, we need to finish, but I need to say one important thing. Maybe I will continue in our another discussion. That I think that the very, very complicated Polish-Ukrainian history, and that Banderites are responsible for the killing most of the 100,000 of Polish population in Volhynia in 1943. And the strategy which Comrade Carlos said, that they try to find some soldiers without Nazi tattoos, it is no longer a case, because now in Poland they understand that it is impossible to find any Ukrainian soldiers without Nazi tattoo. So now they try to make they relativize this Banderist ideology. They try to say, it is not like this. He was not a Nazi. It was a movement for the liberation, national liberation. It is something like a Piłsudski in Poland. So because they know that it is impossible no longer say that there are no problem of Banderites in Ukraine. So they try to present Bandera like a guy. Okay, radical, but he was anti-communist. He hates Russians, so maybe we can accept him. And also in July we will have the 80 anniversary of this killing of Poles. It is in 11 July 1943. So there will be and now this anniversary of Volyn, it is something which before nobody cared, but now it is the central things in the Polish society. If you want to celebrate these things, if you talk about this, you are the Russian spy. So the Polish government now say, don't talk about Volyn, because it can make worse our relations with Ukraine.
I'm surprised.
They say the way and they rehabilitate the Banderites, the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, that was his group, was so extreme and brutal that when the German Nazi Party got to Ukraine, they reprimanded them. They were like, whoa, guys, cool out. And this is the Nazi Party that was there to exterminate and enslave the Slavic people, right? Like it's wild that they would try to just act like, oh, Vander is kind of, he may have been a little extreme, but he was cool. And didn't Zelensky call him a cool dude, by the way?
Yeah, I'm surprised that they haven't gotten the swastika and just tried to say, like, no, it's not the Nazi swastika, it's the Hindu one. they're actually all Buddhists. That's why they have that guy with that little mustache in between that they have tattooed. That's another guy.
Charlie Chaplin, yeah.
That's Charlie Chaplin. They're just fans of Charlie Chaplin, and they're all Buddhists and Hindus, and that's why they have the swastikas.
Mm-hmm.
But,
and then they also really like that one particular little skull. It's just aesthetic.
They're big fans of. They're fans of Pirates of the Caribbean. So they put the skull there because they like Jack Sparrow, and they're Hindu. No, but it's telling of the state of bourgeois liberal democracies and of imperialism that its repression is getting to this level. And I just spoke yesterday with one of my communist friends in Peru, and they're calling the protesters that are waging, which is indigenous people largely and workers and peasants waging a general strike against the coup government. They're calling those people terrorists. And so if you go on social media and you defend those people waging the general strike, they're calling that terrorist terrorist apologetics, and you can get from 8 to 15 years in prison for terrorist apologetics. So it's, if that doesn't symbolize the fact that the global state of capitalism that we're in is moribund, I don't know what does. And I don't think it to be impossible that the U.S. escalates towards something like this within the coming years, just because of the repression that we've seen. I mean, they have algorithmic control that wouldn't let anti-hegemonic views grow as much as they could. I mean, we've seen it in the flesh. We've gotten banned. We've gotten shadow banned, and we probably still are shadow banned. But it's a very dark period, and capital is really showing its claws around the world, and the turn towards fascism, or maybe you could call what's already here as fascism that doesn't present itself as fascism, because when a state when a government like the Biden government is backed by the largest sectors of finance capital and steps in to prevent a rail strike in order to benefit the big industrialists, but not just the industrialists of rail, the shareholders, which are all finance capitalists, what's that if not fascism, my friend? That's fascism. So the same people that do that at home send $100 billion to Nazis in Ukraine. So it's a very scary state that we're in at it. And if the left doesn't get its shit together and take advantage of these objectively revolutionary conditions, it's going to be the barbarism that Rosenberg talked about.
TikTok is a perfect way to examine it. We have a control parallel when it was owned by a Chinese company, and Midwestern Marx was allowed to grow, having almost 500,000 subscribers at that point, millions of views on every single video, just growing exponentially. And then they're forced to sell to an American company, and American intelligence begins changing the algorithms. Suddenly, we're struggling to get, even 50,000, and we keep getting banned over and over and over again. We have videos that don't even do 1,000 views for some reason, which is unheard of. So this is what censorship looks like in the 2020s. And I think because it is so insidious, people don't recognize it. So we need to figure out a good way to put that in the public consciousness. And this is another thing that is only coming from the right at the moment, right? The right is all about fighting censorship. And these fake Marxists, these counter-revolutionaries, are just condemning them and therefore siding with the capitalist class, finance capital, and its censorship. And there's a class issue here because they're mostly the remnants of the middle class. And what is one of the big dogmas about fascism? That it comes from the middle class and the petty bourgeoisie. The reason for this is this cosmopolitan social consciousness this sort of lends itself to superiority. That's the whole thing. But I think it's very telling that they look at themselves as progressive, while every single thing they do is exactly what a fascist force does.
Okay, thank you, comrades. We need to finish because we have difference of time in here in Europe is already evening, and I start work in 4 hour a.m. in night, so I need to have some sleep. So thank you one more time. I hope that we will continue this discussion. Well, I am very happy. So we have contact, and to viewers, I invite to watch your channel, YouTube channel, Midwestern Marx, TikTok. Is exist or they deleted? No.
We just started a new one.
Right.
Yeah, we had we've had it banned like 5 times. We were able to grow it again to 150K or so, 150,000, and then they just banned us like last week. So we started a new one again. But yeah, folks can follow us on our website, midwesternmarx.com, and if they can, check out our books and our journal. We have ebooks of almost everything, specifically our Journal of American Socialist Studies, which just came out. So if they don't mind and they want to help fund the institute, they could do it through buying our books or donating or whatever the case may be. It's going to definitely help us in the long run in fighting the struggle in the U.S., especially as members of our institute, because of the political positions that we take, continue to get harassed at their place of employment. So
I just want to say, Mikhail, thank you so much for having us on. It's been a pleasure.
yeah, thank you, comrade.
I always, I also thank you. So I finish this.